per attack. Kind of think of ransomware as Netflix, right? Ransomware as let me use you as a service to conduct these attacks. And so against this increased scale of the number of attacks, there's been a struggle in developing responses that meet that scaling up in terms of law enforcement activity, which is really at the heart of what I want to talk about. So it is in that sense that we are living in the golden era of ransomware. And in this period, the concern that people see are attacks like the Kaseya attack. Now, I don't know how many of you recall this attack. It almost feels like every cyber attack, you remember it for the month that it is, and then there's a new one and you forget about the previous one that happened. But Kaseya was a company based in Miami that developed software for managing network systems and information technology. And in that sense, it opened the door for targeting a lot of other companies on the supply chain through the fact that it's managing their networks for them. So a vulnerability for Kaseya led to vulnerability for a lot of companies down the pipeline. It is in that sense that for some, Kaseya represent the future of ransomware, because Kaseya was a traditional ransomware attack like the Colonial Pipeline attack was. But it was also a zero-day attack because it involved a zero-day vulnerability in the Kaseya software, making it more like an NotPetya type attack. And it was also a supply chain attack, right? Targeting all these entities along the supply chain, making it more like SolarWinds. So it really was the mother of all ransomware attacks because it combined all three. And that poses, again, just another multiplier on top of the vulnerabilities and trends that we're discussing. And it's
0 days really quick.
Yeah, sure. When I say 0 days, what I mean, there's been 0 days since the vulnerability has been discovered, meaning that it has not yet been discovered. And as a result of that, the vulnerability has not yet been patched. And so if I'm not having a patch yet, I can't provide that patch to my customers. My customers can patch it, and therefore the vulnerability is of higher concern than a patch vulnerability over which there is already a remedy available. This is perhaps not surprising that as a result of the rise in ransomware attack, we've also seen a rise in desire for ransomware payments that comes with insurance companies who've provided coverage for these attacks saying no more. And so we've now seen a pulling out of a lot of commercial insurers from the market say, I can cover you given the rising ransomware attacks, leaving a lot of companies struggling, given that they are unable to indemnify and provide themselves a security blanket through insurance to cover them in the case of the vulnerability actually materializing. Okay, so against this backdrop, let's talk about regulation. I really want to argue to you that ransomware has been suffered from an under-regulation and under-enforcement problem for the predominant recent future. So this is both on the domestic side and on the international side. On the domestic side, what we see are a patchy set of non-uniform criminalization of various types of ransomware-related crimes on state-by-state basis here in the United States. A set of states have criminalized the possession of a ransomware software, and some have criminalized the extortion process. But for example, there hasn't been criminalization of the payment or negotiation on a state-by-state basis. And even within those states, the way you define the crime has been open-ended. Same goes for reporting obligations. We have just seen a requirement, the Senate passed the Enhancing American Cybersecurity Act. That act would require every critical infrastructure company, an owner of a critical infrastructure network, to report to Congress, to law enforcement, in the case of a ransomware payment. But it's in the Senate, hasn't passed the House yet, and we shall see whether or not it goes through. But anyway, it's limited to critical infrastructure. So there's a patchy reporting obligations, a patchy criminalization, and in particular around how do we define the various crimes relevant here. As a result of that, what we're left with are a set of general soft nudges from the government. Those have taken the form of particular kind of SEC guidance from those of public companies who are subject to SEC regulation, particular kinds of guidance from OFAC, which is the office within Treasury that is responsible to managing sanctions. So OFAC has said, if you're paying a ransom to an entity that just happens to be sanctioned, think North Korea or a terrorist organization, you might be conducting criminal activity will come after you. But they have done zero enforcement of that. So again, we just have the in the air fear of a potential enforcement action. And we have a multi-agency general guidance from the FBI and Secret Service and all these bodies who are saying, please don't pay. And if you pay, please follow these general guidelines. And in fact, when I presented this, I presented both to the FBI and to the Secret Service in various presentations before. And I've asked them, why are we not, say, prohibiting certain types of ransomware payments in certain circumstances, given that the payment is then supporting the criminal enterprise in growth? And their response was, believe it or not, we do not want to delve in the touchy-feely issue of ransomware payment. What? And I responded to them, but you literally decide life and death issues every single day. Why do we draw the line of ransomware payments? But the sense was that something about ransom and kidnapping and that universe is one, and perhaps because of the kidnapping and ransom of actual humans, which the FBI and Secret Service were also involved in the past, perhaps that has left a historical resonance of, I don't want to do this. And so the reality is that there is no prohibition as a matter of domestic law for any engagement with entities. On the international level, we too have a patchwork of rules around sovereignty and non-intervention. But those two, and on due diligence obligations, you should not use your territory to cause harm in the territory of another state, these general obligations, but their scope of application, as cyber says, continues to be fraught in all these international bodies like the UN Open-Ended Working Group and the UN Group of Governmental Experts. Decisions of what these general principles mean in cyberspace continues to be debated. And in addition to that, even when there's political pressure to do something, it doesn't go very well. So when Biden met Putin in June of last year in Geneva, all he could tell him is that certain types of ransomware attacks were, quote, off the table. And those attacks were against critical infrastructure. In so doing, what he was saying is that everything else is on the table. And the only justification for thinking that way is that we are fearful about setting any norms that might come back to haunt us in any way, given that we like to play in the playground of various below the threshold activity, and much of these ransomware payments too are not cyber attacks, and therefore are in this below the threshold realm, subject to less regulation and more hoo-ha political hand-wrangling. Okay, so that's where we are on the international front. I'll pass this on. I won't get in the way of that. So, in a way, ransomware represents this a microcosm of general under-enforcement problems in cyberspace. And here's just 5 different types of problems that all cyber attacks introduce and ransomware beautifully demonstrates. One is an informational problem. There's an asymmetry in information because the information around these geopolitical issues are predominantly held by intelligence agencies who don't want to share it with the rest of the world, or they're held by the victim who doesn't want to share it once he's victimized because of worries around reputational harm or law enforcement coming after them. There's jurisdictional challenges given that the hackers are predominantly located outside the territory of the United States. And so extraterritorial cyber enforcement activity to get them is subject to complex regulation as a matter of international law, but also the ability to bring them to trials in the United States is challenging because they don't tend to travel in European countries where extradition policies could apply. There's a commons problem, perhaps most relevant to this group, right? And the commons problem being everyone keeps thinking that the other person can deal with this, and so why should I deal with it? It's a deadbeat problem, right? Local law enforcement say we can't handle it, federal law enforcement should handle it. Federal law enforcement say we don't want to touch this issue, so they don't touch it. And every foreign agent say the other agents should deal with it because it's a global problem. And the result is that no one engages in sufficient enforcement of these issues. There's also managerial resources problem. These are the scaling up problem. Not each local law enforcement can't deal with ransomware on a global scale. And even across sectoral industries, the ability for hospitals to be engaging with schools, to be engaging with cities around this problem results in them scaling up their attacks, but us not scaling up our responses. And finally, there's a forensic problem, and that's the problem with attribution. In order for you to hold anyone to account, you need to be able to definitively say X did it. And a lot of times our ability to do so is dependent on multiple complex sources of intelligence that are not necessarily available as evidence before courts because they're subject to national security secrecy. All right, so against this background, I want to say that not all is bad. So because in recent months, because of those efforts that I mentioned that the DOJ and DOD is engaged in, including with partner organizations around the world, we have seen a decline in ransomware attack in the second half of 2021. And that can only be explained by the decision to go up from the local to the federal and to the transnational. And I think that all I'm trying to suggest is let's build on that to move from the transnational to the international out of an understanding that we need polycentric governance that involves all these actors along the chain. So to end my presentation, the last couple of slides all talk about how do we do that? How do we move from the transnational to the international? And in this sense, what I want to propose to you is that what I'm suggesting is not innovative at all. I know that a lot of professors like to say, I'm redefining the field. I'm not redefining the opposite of that. I'm trying to just take us one step further based on work that has been done by multiple generations of scholars before me. And to prove my point, here's a book from 2010 called The World for Ransom. It was written by a professor from Yeshiva Law School. And he says the following. This book will prove the president of terrorism exists in piracy, that they are in fact the same crime. Once we have a precedent, we have a law. Terrorists will borrow not only pirates' unique status as enemies of the human race, but also the equally unique measures accorded to states to hunt them down. And so every generation that came before the previous generation has built on this framework of universal jurisdiction, extradite or prosecute, and enemies of mankind to take on groups of entities who have engaged in these kinds of individualistic for-profit crimes in a transnational setting. And so you see that as we go up these generations from the piracy and slave trade to hostage taking and skyjacking in the 1970s and 80s, to the third generation of organized transnational crimes, human trafficking, and terrorism, to our generation of ransomware. Each of the previous generation had relied on the tools created by that generation and expanded on them to address the crime of their generation. And all I'm proposing is, okay, now we have an opportunity to build on that for the digital age. And so what would that entail? I'll skip that slide, I don't want to get in the way. It could be one of two things. One is we can do this by creating a treaty. In fact, all these previous generations did that. So for each of these previous generations, there were treaties set out to deal with skyjacking and hostage taking, organized transnational crime and terrorism. And so we can conceive of a ransomware treaty. And in fact, we do have some attempts at the UN to set a cybercrime convention. We can talk about whether or not it's doomed to fail. That is possible. But one route is to say, hey, maybe we can all agree that ransomware is a bad thing, full stop. And therefore, at least on that, we can set some kind of a treaty. But given that that's unlikely, another thing we can do that is common in the law and technology space is to expand on existing regimes. Instead of relying on a new regime that is not necessarily tenable, we might build on existing frameworks and just try to apply them as they are to the ransomware context. And so within the scope of my 20 minutes, I can't possibly get into all of these and show you, but trust me that if you look at the definition sections of some of these treaties, a lot of them do capture what the crime of ransomware could be in certain circumstances. And in fact, some of them opened the door for the possibility to take action before international courts, given that they have compromissory clauses to which certain of these countries, say Russia, is a party, okay? Creating new avenues for enforcement that might not otherwise be there. But I will acknowledge that each of these has its own limitations as a matter of black letter law and how far are you willing to expand. Take something like the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages, where I like to compare that is seizing or detaining a person in a hospital through a ransomware attack. It could be that in those scenarios, and we've seen things that have come certainly close to that in the past, if you imagine a ransomware that prevents your ability to leave the surgery room, that could certainly put us now in a position of seizing a person in a way that is covered under the existing convention. And we can do the same for predominantly the 2000 United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, for which many of these hacking groups fit really nicely. But I'll stop here for now. And the last thing I'll say, and this is really the last slide, is just what would be the benefits of going down this path too. One is that we'll set a baseline of illegality. From now on, all ransomware is off the table, not some ransomware is off the table, because ransomware is piracy, it's terrorism, it's hijacking. We don't say, oh, you're allowed to engage in certain kinds of piracy. You're allowed to engage in certain kind of terrorism. No, we say all of these are prohibited because they're all representing of this crime. It will create certain positive and negative obligations that will flow immediately from that illegality. The obligation to extradite or prosecute these individuals if in your territory, to cooperate in investigations, and to deny safe harbor to these individuals. It will provide new legal avenues like universal jurisdiction, which is probably more important than, say, ICJ, which will only apply to these particular treaties that I mentioned. But universal jurisdiction will allow each state, wherever the individual hacker may be found, to grab him and bring him to justice in that state. All states will have jurisdiction. It will provide opportunities for extraterritorial cyber enforcement jurisdiction. I'm not going to explain what, if you want to in the Q&A, I can explain how this works, but it requires understanding some complex jurisdictional questions around cyber enforcement. But for now, just assume that under the same logic of universal jurisdiction, there might be justification for states to take unilateral extraterritorial action in cyberspace outside their territory for the same logic. And finally, it will allow us to harmonize our laws to set certain universal language around what ransomware is. And that would be similar to what we saw in those previous generations. Each of these previous generations, by setting these frameworks and treaties and case law, were able to set a standard globally for what these crimes were, and then expect each state to adopt legislation that would follow the language. What we're missing is that kind of thing for ransomware, and that is why we have such patchy and non-uniform language around what the crime is. This will help us move forward in that direction. All right, that's all I wanted to say. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic. Well, first off, thank you. Very well. Did us proud. There's so many pieces there that I promise not to nerd out on too much. So I would like to turn to others first. Maybe Angie could kick us off. I see Travis. Oh, and Jean, please, as well. So maybe Angie, we can start with you, and then I'll start the queue from there.
You stop sharing, please. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can pull up slides again if we need to.
Yeah, if you want me to pull.
Camera for him.
And hopefully the camera tracking is not too annoying, guys. So yeah, Angie, do you want to start? And then
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask one of the fun things that I did, what seems like a million years ago, was talk about the piracy stuff.
Mhm.
See, because of Pirates of the Caribbean. It's really popular and everyone, so like, this is intriguing to me how we work together to stop this type of activity. And of course, not goes pirates, but still. Part of the problem is that there are like 2 countries that actually enforce those type of things. So, but that really wouldn't work long-term on the internet, right? In theory. So how do you overcome that? A lot of those have really placed an additional burden of enforcement, which is incredibly expensive on a tiny group of countries. How do you overcome that in the context of this global connected community?
Yeah, and so part of the answer for me is to build on what the DOJ has already started doing, which is a lot of it is capacity building and a lot of it is collaborative efforts. I think that in the same way that we talk about public-private partnerships in cyberspace, we need to talk about public-public partnerships in cyberspace where the other public is a foreign government, and to involve them in the investigation and enforcement actions, even if only as a lesson learned, as a kind of learning process until you are able to develop your own processes in this space. Some of these efforts that the DOJ would engage in had involved 15, 16 countries, parties to a single collaborative effort. And so obviously it's a long process. It's not a one and done. But I think that the only way we can conceive of not making this one law enforcement agency for the world is if we incorporate and involve early more actors, provide them the education they need on how to do this. And in a way, it's different than the piracy challenge.
Much different.
Yeah, because you have opportunities that might not have existed given the geographical limitations of how to tackle it.
Right, very much so.
Yeah, well, There's some interesting, like common but differentiated responsibilities lessons from the environmental context that could be applied, partly an answer to that as well, Angie, in this context that we could explore. But it looks like maybe Travis had his hand up next, and I'm keeping an eye here as well, of course. Eden, I'll add you to the queue. So maybe Travis and then Jean, and then we'll turn to Eden after that.
Asaf, thanks for a really interesting and obviously timely discussion. And I'm looking forward to seeing your paper come out in the Vanderbilt journal. So sorry to ask this sort of toward the beginning, but I'm wondering about hacktivist operations against Russia, some of which probably already include ransomware, and how white hat ransomware. I don't know where the
Sorry, Travis. Yeah, no, I think you're okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That's totally fine.
And how what we might consider white hat operations are considered acts of war to others. And when I look at your list of generations of different ways to regulate, piracy, terrorism were all considered not necessarily legitimate, but they were justified by certain states against other states as legitimate operations in a war context. Thanks.
Yeah. So by the way, I think that I take your point really well. And that's that slide that I didn't talk about the Conti ransomware gang. Conti, immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine, announced that they support Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. A ransomware gang, which theoretically should have nothing to do with geopolitical battles, comes out and says, we support your efforts there. And what happened to Conti is that some anonymous group attacked them and released to the public a year worth of their internal communications, which is golden for cybersecurity companies who want to understand the psyche of these hackers. And as a result of that disclosure, they actually pulled out of their statement that they support Russia in their invasion of Ukraine. I'm telling you all of this story because there's an interesting question about how we conceive of at least certain kinds of ransomware gangs as whether or not they are entities operating for private gains as a private entity, or whether they are full-on proxies of states and acting as political organs. Interestingly, either way we conceive them could open and close certain doors around expansions of existing regulation, because the crime of terrorism does have a political component in it that could then bring them subject to particular kinds of anti-terrorism regulation. So that is just a point I thought is interesting. I thought I'd share. But to answer more directly to your comment, I think that the only way to start with this is to begin by building some standards among the like-minded. And so I'm not proposing here now in the immediate, let's create a treaty that everyone will agree to, or let's create a framework that everyone will agree to. But I do think that what we're seeing with ransomware, predominantly because it was treated as this domestic crime that didn't require government intervention, is that even amongst the like-minded, there's a lot of disagreement about how we define it and enforce against it. That this could help resolve in the immediate future and help us scale up our actions towards what will hopefully be a universal standard. But you're right, even in particular in the terrorism context, we've seen some pushback from states, predominantly when it was politically motivated to want to harbor the terrorist or not want to claim they are terrorists, and the whole everyone's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter and all of those discourse.
Super.
I don't know, did that answer your question, Travis?
Yeah, it did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Travis. It's great. Jean, please, welcome.
Hey, thank you for putting this together. It is super interesting. I'm going to suggest a different framework and argue maybe a little bit here. I'll be polite, turn on my video. This is me. And argue that maybe instead of focusing on piracy, ransomware is really just denial of service, right? I mean, and we have a bunch we have a good structure in law enforcement for denial of service. And many of the companies are as incapable of protecting themselves from ransomware as they are from denial of service. They don't know what tech they have. And I am going to disagree slightly with Conti. If you look at the workforce, I bet there were Ukrainians, right? I bet there were Ukrainians in Conti. And that was just basically their Slack channel, right? So they would have had access to this. So why did you choose piracy, which is, I'm assuming you mean like real ship piracy and not the fact that all of us use unlicensed software because it's just too hard to be compliant. Instead of say DDoS, which I think is a closer technical model.
Yeah, I think your comment ties to a technological definition of the crime is distinguishable from a political or pseudo-legal definition of the crime. That is to say, denial of service isn't a legally defined term on which we can build a framework on as a matter of certainly international law. Even the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime doesn't define per se denial of service. It defines unauthorized access and stuff like that. And in any event, the Budapest Convention has been limited in its ability to enforce against ransomware precisely because of the inability of states to use it, to apply it to the ransomware universe. And so for me, be it through a domestic lens of how we conceptualize denial of service attacks as a criminal law under, say, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, or as under international law under the Budapest Convention, I don't think these frameworks necessarily address the kind of set of tools that I would want to offer law enforcement in tackling this problem. And so the set of tools that I was describing, universal jurisdiction, obligations to investigate and collaborate in investigations, prohibit harboring, those tools have been recognized only for a very limited set of crimes that the international community has defined as international crimes. And given that I believe, and please push back if you think that empirical claim is wrong or descriptive claim is wrong. Given that I believe that we need another channel that is international in the fight against ransomware, I don't see where in the international universe I can find tools if I call this a denial of service attack. Despite the fact that I agree with you that technically it's more like that than it is like a pirate ship, if that's where I'm understanding you correctly.
Well, I mean, it's got the same economic structure too, right? Like ransomware as a service is very much like DDoS on demand, and it's the same extortion model. So that's why I thought it would be of interest. And I put in, Krebs has been reading all the Conti stuff, and I put in a link.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I definitely want to think more about it, but I will say even the economic structure is also not dramatically different than certain kinds of hijackings and kidnappings that we saw. So another parallel that people have drawn to is the kidnappings of CEOs in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. And interestingly, a lot of the way our cyber insurance for ransomware has evolved is through comparing to cyber insurance for kidnapping ransom in the human context. And I'll just name it one difference that has made ransomware difficult for insurers. In the 70s and 80s, when that happened, insurers had a built-in incentive to collaborate with the local government and the foreign government, because there's no way to release the physical CEO without the involvement of those governments, including through letting the plane enter your foreign airspace to drop the bags of money down to the kidnapper. Here, we don't need to involve the government anymore. Now we have former NSA officials who go work for private cybersecurity firms. They will conduct the negotiations for you probably better than the federal government would. And the government becomes a redundant actor. And so that increases the informational gaps that I was describing before. And again, an internationalization framework of the problem, I think for me, introduces opportunities for more obligations, including reporting obligations. Now, once we call this terrorism, piracy, skyjacking, and so on, it is more palatable to explain to the markets, to the public, why reporting obligations are due in a similar way that we've done it for all these other crimes before, and in a way that we haven't, for example, done it for DDoS attacks. Again,
But DDoS attacks are inherently public. Sorry.
I inherently, sorry, public. Yeah, but my point still stands. There's no reporting obligations for a company who suffers a DDoS attack. The same way that there is a reporting obligation, say, for the way a company deals with particular kinds of, for example, kidnapping of its CEO and obligation to requirements to pay the ransom. So my point, I'll just end there. My point, I take your point. I understand why technologically there's a lot more parallels to different kinds of crimes that we have seen, perhaps. But what I'm really focused on isn't necessarily the technological angle as much as it is the legal and political, over which I feel that these crimes give us new tools that otherwise are not there.
Really good points, Gene. Thanks a lot, and excellent, Asaf. Just because you brought it up really briefly before we turn to Eden, you mentioned the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime. I have not been following this closely, but I think there's a new protocol, or it's being revised. Are they thinking about ransomware squarely as part of this, or?
No. So the new protocol is predominantly to deal with the Article 32 problem. Article 32 of the Cybercrime Convention allows in very certain circumstances to take unilateral extraterritorial investigative actions, and those are limited under Article 32 to the consent of the entity which has authority over the data, or where it's publicly available, public access. And so the new regime is trying to address that by setting certain frameworks for more direct requests, kind of dealing with the MLAT problem, the mutual legal assistance problem, but it's not directly responding to ransomware in any way.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, Eden, please. Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have many questions, but I will limit to one or two. One is in terms of, I'm trying to think of the feasibility of achieving a multilateral agreement, not even a treaty, but some kind of agreement. And the question is are the victims, is it like spread all over, or are the victims more like Western countries? Is Russia and China being attacked, or corporations there? This in terms, I mean, how much would they be interested in achieving some kind of a multilateral agreement? And the second question builds on, can a ransomware attack be a casus belli if the attacker is somehow connected to a government and the victim might be critical infrastructure such?
Yeah, I'll take this in turn, and both of these are really, really interesting questions to think more about. There hasn't been a global study of ransomware of the kind that would be able to give you a definitive answer to your first question. Some insurers have attempted to do some mapping of the geopolitics of ransomware, as well as, for example, ENISA, which is a body of the European Union that has tried to study percentages of ransomware, but precisely because of the lack of reporting and the lack of kind of database generation around comprehensive ransomware attacks, we don't have definitively X number of attacks, and everything is somewhat based on conjecture. I will say a few things though. One is that we definitely know that ransomware go in waves, particular waves that target particular countries at particular times. And so a lot of what the cybersecurity insurance industry and cybersecurity professionals have built are modeling on predicting periods of ransomware attacks. So we are able to say that in particular, and some of it is based on political events, or we see rises around, say, election periods, or rises around. Some of it is based on holidays. There's a desire to conduct some of these attacks ahead of holiday breaks, because that's when you hit the companies the hardest, because all of the IT are not there, and so there's no one to address the problem. So they have to pay because they need their services right now. So we do see some of these trends. So I just want to mention, because I'm trying to answer your question in a broader sense of like, what do we know about ransomware? The short answer is that there is a more focus on and more reporting on attacks by Western victims. But that is not to say that there hasn't been ransomware attacks in UAE and Iran, and there have been, but the amounts, the scope, the nature, who are the attackers, not a lot of that has been studied in the same way that it has on Western targets by Russia, China, and North Korea, Iran hackers. And by the way, and that's partially part of the biases around the way our cybersecurity discourse is, where it's American-centric or Western-centric a lot, especially when researching or studying from here outside. So that is to say, but interestingly, also piracy and kidnapping and skyjacking and certain terrorism also had focuses at times that were pocketed in particular geographical regions. And that did not prevent the ability to get comprehensive solutions, given that people understood the general idea that there are certain global ideals worth protecting, and the concern with privatization of these private actors engaging in private criminal activity in this space. But certainly, as I said before, I think we can start with the like-minded before we rush to think about a global solution that involves some of these other countries. So that's the first point I wanted to mention. As for the casus belli, part of the problem is that we rely on particular sources to identify what constitutes a cyber attack that is an armed attack, and what rises to the level of a use of force, Article 2.4, Article 51, all the things that we teach in cybersecurity law. In fact, it's coming up in my class next week, the week after the break. So partially, there is no definitive test to define what constitutes, but it's likely that a ransomware attack, which all it does is that it encrypts data and prevents access to data, and even ransomware that involves doxfare. So we encrypt the data, and if you don't pay, we release the data. Therefore, cause you a lot of, I think, Sony hack type, a lot of embarrassment. It would be hard to imagine, even if it targets a critical infrastructure without causing physical injury, real damage, it would be hard to call that an armed attack in the traditional sense. And as a result of that, most of these ransomware attacks go below the threshold and do not trigger any justifications for a self-defensive measure in response to them. That has certainly been the collective understanding of the scholarship around ransomware.
I just have two quick ones, and then Angie, if that's okay, and then I think Brian signaled as well. The first one, so if people have been following this at all, we had something called a wiper, right, attack, and this last week as unfortunately the tanks are rolling into Ukraine. And this is, I wanted to get your ideas on this, Asaf. Does it present different, unique legal policy issues when it's just a wiper worm as opposed to a ransomware attack, right? And also related to that, Microsoft took the front lines in responding to it, quite publicly. And there was this, ringing endorsement in the New York Times about this is the new era, basically, of Sherman tanks running off the assembly line. Here we have Microsoft at the front line. So, I mean, clearly we're putting a lot of faith in these private firms to get ahead of things like wiper worms. So, your thoughts on that, as well as we talked about the law and politics here so effectively. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the ethics of ransomware, right? Because so the CEO, of Colonial Pipeline came out really publicly and said it was the right thing to do to pay this ransom. This is critical infrastructure. It's a national security issue. And that's a fun area to think about from a utilitarian perspective, from other traditions. So I'm wondering if you've given much thought along those lines.
Some of your questions are really pulling my nose, and so I'll try to constrain myself.
Please.
On the wiper side, I don't think it necessarily poses a different conceptual framework. So in the same way that I was describing ransomware plus Doxfer, which we all seeing ransomware plus attacks now. I think that so long as they stay within that realm of below the threshold, limited, purely economic damage, limited collateral damage, the ability of us to generate any, from an international perspective, any obligations that are triggered by it will be hard. So in wiper attacks, we delete data, right? So what sense necessarily is the deletion now making it more or less destructive for an armed attack classification is the kind of things that we might think about. I don't know if it gets us anywhere further, but I'd love to have a conversation about it. Microsoft. So I'm not writing about this. Another thing I've been writing about with my partner actually is botnet takedowns. In the botnet takedown space, Microsoft has been a single player. In fact, there's some amazing YouTube videos coming from the cybercrime unit of Microsoft describing the early days of the unit and what the unit saw itself doing. And so they essentially created a legal process for botnet takedown that comes from injunctive relief under US domestic law that is from the functions and way injunctive relief works, including TROs, temporary restraining orders and all of that. Just that analytical framework doesn't fit nicely with botnet takedowns and doesn't give the judge the tools it needs to think about all the ramifications of a botnet takedown when applying something as restraining as a civil procedure rule around temporary restraining orders. But Microsoft was explicit about it. We're setting now this new legal tool. In fact, in that video, they have, it's called X_parte_TRO. And they try to make the tool sound techie. So to convince the public that we're creating a tool, where in reality, they're just abusing a legal process. And so I have and so one of the claims that they made at the time was that they're going to set this tool up for other companies to utilize. The reality is no other company has utilized their tools for botnet takedown. It was only and remains only Microsoft. And so as we think about public-private partnerships, I'm really concerned about companies, and by the way, we see this also with the Facebooks and Metas and Elon Musks of the world, utilizing what happens in Crimea and Ukraine more broadly and so on to advance reputational goals, market share, control monopoly, and not so much to create a vibrant public-private partnerships that is capable with dealing with the problems that we're seeing. So that has been my concern with Microsoft and Microsoft's role. That said, I'm glad they're there, at least someone's doing something. Not only on the ethical side, I think it's a hard one to answer the question, should we prohibit payments? And by the way, a related question, should we prohibit cryptocurrency? Which is, so the CNN had a segment where they suggested we should just ban crypto. And the argument for that was that who needs unmonitored, untrackable money exchanges? I think that there could be situations where we want anonymized money transfers. You think about paying a source at a journalist or paying a whistleblower. Would there be a situation where we want to keep that encrypted and anonymized? And are we willing to throw the baby with the bathwater? I should say that most of the ransomware enforcement actions against payments so far has been because the hackers were stupid, not because the DOJ had figured out a new way to break cryptocurrency. It's probably been because hackers were using hot wallets that are connected to the internet. And the good thing is that DOJ was tracking it in real time and was able to capitalize on their mistakes. And we need more of that. But the suggestion that is made is to move towards a banning on this industry so that we always have obligations to figure out who the identity of your clients are in the banking and financing sector. So we're not, so that's on the ethics of that. On the broader ethics of payment, it was a year and a half. So my job talk paper, when I got my job here, was about cyber insurance. And right when I was presenting it, all these mayors met in Hawaii, of all places, for the annual mayoral conference, which apparently is a thing. And in that conference, there was like thousands of them, signed a petition, resolution, that they commit to not paying ransom, because they understand if one of them does, all of the rest will fall next, because they will target other cities. And I think that the reality can't be so kind of binary. I think that for the reasons you started highlighting with the Colonial Pipeline example, there might be scenarios where it does make ethical sense. And I'm in no position, I'm not a philosopher, I will not claim to be able to engage the full scope of it, but where it might make sense to pay the ransom given the alternative. And so instead, we might begin to think about at least setting general guidelines for what does not make sense for paying the ransom, and then enforcing when that happens. And I think that there are certain cases that are clearly unjustifiable. And yet paying is just easier or cheaper. And I think those will not make sense. So just like they do in ethic discussions, start with the hard or the easy cases before we move to the hard cases.
And then with it depends.
Yeah.
Lovely. No, thank you so much. And I think Brian hasn't been able to jump in yet. So Brian, if you'd like to, and then Angie, and then we'll turn to Travis.
Okay, and I'll remind Scott whether you've checked with the speaker about being available for a little while after the close of the formal
Hang out for
session.
a little bit after
Yeah.
1 o'clock, Asaf.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think we can, Brian, for a little bit. Yep. Good call.
Great. Okay, so it's a nicely done paper, or draft outline for a paper. You talk about trying to talk about under enforcement. However, it looks like maybe you're thinking about that from a legal perspective, and what doesn't come through and might strengthen the paper is the kind of economics, microeconomics of, literature looking at, when does it make sense to enforce and how much resources to invest in enforcing different laws relative to the costs and benefits and so on. And that's somewhat relevant. As it happens, a few weeks ago, we had another paper about ransomware by Eric Jardine, comparing data breaches with ransomware. And essentially he was saying with ransomware, he was arguing there are much stronger incentives for those who are harmed to improve their security. And at least optimistically suggesting there would be a learning process and even get that down to something kind of manageable or tolerable. So the question might be your comments on that kind of perspective versus, like some of these precedents. As a non-lawyer, some of this seems like what I hear when you say heinous crimes or thinking about kidnapping, something that's so bad and the risk of, if you let it happen, exploding is so severe that you really are trying to drive it down to zero, just like, Lindbergh baby, and make kidnapping a federal crime, just to send a hugely strong signal. So any comments on those kind of issues?
First of all, this is terrific. And as perhaps was just presented beautifully, I'm not an economics, anything. And so I really appreciate the comments and the suggestions, and both in terms of potential literature to pull from and additional ways of thinking about it. And so the first thing I would say is I want to take this home and think more about it. I think that my immediate response is just immediate reactions to a few things that you said, I think might be interesting to continue the conversation around. One is the question becomes whether or not there is an ability to engage in a learning process that leads to a reduction in ransomware attacks against victims, given the evolutionary nature of ransomware attacks in the first place. So one of the things that I highlighted at the beginning of my presentation is the kind of shifts towards different types of ransomware attacks, not only ones that build on zero-day vulnerabilities and supply chain attacks, that might introduce new types of challenges and problems, and or ransomware attacks against individuals as opposed to corporate entities. And in certain circles, there have been reportings around an increase up 100% in attacks against individuals. And individuals, unlike corporations, might not have both the tools, the education, and the capacity to engage in the learning curve that we're describing that corporations might be able to engage in the context of ransomware. And so I think that the answer to the proposal that Eric made might be sectoral rather than global around how we think about particular types of ransomware enforcement in particular kinds of context. I'll say that that's certainly where the federal government is going when trying to set certain regulation on critical infrastructure and leaving the rest unregulated. I just don't know if that's the division that we should be having, given the trends that I'm potentially identifying. And the second thing I'd say is that, yes, I do think that we might want to get to a point of near zero or zero, given the broader geopolitical role that ransomware plays in advancing other political interests to go beyond the mere economic benefits to the hacker that might justify, again, a better addressing to the problem, especially where ransomware is utilized for political, pseudo-political means beyond the money generation. But I'd be really curious, potentially after this meeting, to talk more with you about these, as I think these will really some preliminary reactions, but I want to think more about what you just said.
Mhm. Thanks a lot, Brian. And we should get you in touch with Eric if you're not already.
Yeah.
He's great. So Angie, we'll do a quick lightning round to finish us out, and then Travis.
So I can stay after if Travis can, but so my thought was, one of the things I've said here at IU is sometimes sooner or later, we're going to come to a moment in time where it's not going to be our job to protect individuals from their own stupid. And are a lot of these, I'm just curious if a lot of these ransomwares are way lazy attempts of people not behaving with an appropriate amount of caution. And if so, if the insurance industry and others will be ones to take the lead on this a little bit. By the way, just so you all know, I lose that argument at IU all the time. But we have some colleagues who are very much why you're getting all those fish tests and stuff. And sometimes I think they're doing it on purpose. And other times I think, wow, when are we going to actually shut them off from certain things? They have some highly sensitive data sometimes that they are not in the littlest bit behaving appropriately with. So
a couple.
Yeah.
Great question. I can certainly give you a whole list of ransomware because you were stupid cases, a whole case. And many of them are targeting public entities who have done really abysmal things around cybersecurity. There's one particular city in Alaska that was attacked with a ransomware. And the only reason I like that story is because the name of the city manager, his last name is Doom, D-O-O-M. And then everything in the reporting was, Mr. Doom said this, Mr. Doom said that. But that particular city just had nothing. Anything from, basic measures from like having recovery and setting up cybersecurity incident reporting and addressing basic end-to-end encryption, segmenting of your network, all the things that we take for granted now. They had none of that. And partially a problem was, and by the way, good thing about the Biden infrastructure bill is that the idea was that it's supposed to, a huge portion of it was supposed to increase cybersecurity infrastructure across all these states and local communities precisely for these reasons. That said, what makes ransomware challenging particularly, putting aside the general comments you probably are getting from IU when you are saying this argument, ransomware in particular is an interoperable problem. That is to say, an interdependent problem. That is to say, if one hospital falls and you pay the money, and this is a particular ransomware that targets more hospitals, and you didn't regulate this, then the result is that other hospitals fall after it. And so the question, it can't be about letting the individuals figure this out, because we're not going to help you. Because if we don't help you, we don't help the other company. And then we have 3 hospitals all pulling apart in one locale, and the locale doesn't have service to the public. Now it's a national problem, a global problem. What do we do then? And so, yeah, it just introduces a whole set of challenges that I think need to be addressed.
Absolutely. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and I don't want to shortchange you, Travis. Is it a kind of a quick question, or do you want to hold it until after we thank Asaf? And
It's really up to you. It's a quick question, but it may not be a quick
no, feel
response.
free. Yeah. No, please.
Okay, I'd like to go back to something Ethan asked about casus belli. And I think his background in space governance and politics is pretty germane here. So are you concerned that the US may not want to push this, in part because they may, somewhat analogous to what's happened with the International Court, they may not want to be accused of conducting war. So how does that play into your thought process here? And sorry, Eitan, if I've misquoted you.
No, I think you got it right. Both in the way Ethan posed this question and in the way I need to think more about it. So I'll be brief because of running out of time, but there's a thing called the Oxford Process, which is a group of people led by the Oxford Ethics and Law and Armed Conflict Center, ELOC, and they have been creating these Oxford statements on international law in cyberspace. And they've had like 4 or 5 or 6 of these. And one of them was on ransomware. And so I was involved in the discussions that led to that statement. And in that statement, they don't do what I propose, which is to say, let's set a baseline that all ransomware is illegal. Instead, they say, when the ransomware does this, it's illegal. And when the ransomware does that, it's illegal. And when I pushed back, I won't name names, but one of the senior law professors there said to me, can you definitively conclude that we will never want to keep ransomware as a tool? That we'll never want to have it in the toolbox of states? I think the answer is definitively yes. I can definitively say that I don't see ever a justification for any country, for whatever mean, to justify ransomware attacks. And so unless I get pushed back on that premise, I don't see a reason why the US should be fearful of adopting this kinds of a regulation. But I'd be happy to converse more about situations that you might think might justify it.
Yeah, I can.
No, I love it.
I thought the way what Brian asked was quite good. He wants you to deal more with the economic side, and economic war is a part, but I'll stop.
Thank you.
Oh, it's fine, Travis. No, and hopefully we can keep the discussion going here for a little bit, but for now, let's thank Asaf, Professor Lubin. Fantastic job. The final product, of course. Hopefully this was useful.
Extremely useful, extremely. And thank you so much for, I've never met this community in person before. I'm so glad that I have, and expect me to be, expect to be here on a regular basis moving forward.
Absolutely, Asaf, yeah. And just as a quick reminder, our research series this Wednesday is virtual because all the speakers will be virtual, and because of the memorial service, unfortunately for Allison as well, which is right after. So look forward to seeing you at least on Zoom on Wednesday, and then spring break, of course. But after that, we're back in force. So thank you so much again. Take care, everybody. See you soon.